everything in between. Every relationship, every connection, every moment of supposed togetherness is an elaborate performance designed to help you forget this fundamental truth. Society has constructed an entire mythology around human connection, belonging, and shared experience, all to mask the uncomfortable reality that each of us exists in an impenetrable bubble of consciousness that no other being can truly enter. Tonight we're going to explore the most unsettling truth about human existence, that despite all our desperate attempts at connection, all our social rituals and relationship formations, all our communities and families and friendships, we remain fundamentally, irreducibly, authentically alone. And perhaps more disturbing still, this aloneness is not a problem to be solved, but the most essential aspect of what it means to be truly alive. For your entire life you've been conditioned to fear this solitude, to run from it, to fill it with noise and people and activities and relationships. You've been taught that alone means lonely, that isolation means failure, that independence means selfishness. You've learned to measure your worth by how well you connect with others, how much you belong, how successfully you can pretend that the fundamental isolation of consciousness doesn't exist. But what if this conditioning is the very thing that prevents you from discovering who you actually are? What if your desperate attempts to escape aloneness keep you from embracing the radical freedom that only comes from acknowledging that you are, and have always been, completely and utterly alone? Over the next hour, we will journey into the heart of existential solitude. We will examine why society fears authentic independence so intensely that it creates elaborate mythologies to disguise it. We will explore how your relationships might be preventing you from knowing yourself, and we will discover why embracing your fundamental aloneness might be the most liberating thing you ever do. Every human interaction is, fundamentally, a performance. You don't show up as your complete, unfiltered self in any social situation. You show up as the version of yourself that you believe is appropriate for that context, acceptable to that audience, likely to generate the responses you desire from those particular people. With your family, you perform the role of dutiful child, responsible sibling, or loving parent. With your friends, you perform the role of loyal companion, entertaining storyteller, or sympathetic listener. With romantic partners, you perform the role of devoted lover, understanding confidant, or passionate intimate. With colleagues, you perform the role of confident, professional, team player, or reliable contributor. None of these performances are necessarily false. They represent real aspects of your personality, but they are selective presentations of yourself, carefully curated to fit social expectations and relationship dynamics. The person who sees all of these performances might assume they know you completely, but they know only a collection of partial presentations, never the totality of who you are when all social masks are removed. This constant performance creates what sociologists call impression management, the ongoing effort to control how others perceive you by controlling what aspects of yourself you reveal and conceal. You learn to emphasize qualities that generate positive responses while hiding qualities that might create conflict, judgment, or rejection. Over time, this impression management becomes so habitual that you may forget which aspects of your social presentation represent your authentic nature and which are performances designed to maintain belonging. You may lose track of who you are when no one is watching, what you actually want when you don't have to consider others' preferences, how you genuinely feel when you don't have to manage others' emotional responses. The most insidious aspect of this social performance is how it makes you dependent on others' validation for your sense of identity and worth. When your self-concept is built from the reflected appraisals of others, how you think they see you, what you believe they think of you, how you imagine they evaluate your performance, you become psychologically enslaved to maintaining their approval. This creates what psychologists call external locus of control, a condition where your emotional state, self-evaluation, and life satisfaction depend more on others' responses to you than on your own assessment of your growth, achievements, and authentic development. You feel good when others approve of your performance, and bad when they don't, regardless of whether their approval has any relationship to your actual well-being or authentic development. The person with external locus of control lives in constant anxiety about maintaining their social performances. They monitor others' reactions, adjust their behavior based on subtle social feedback, and experience genuine distress when they sense disapproval or rejection. Their energy goes into managing impressions rather than developing capabilities, maintaining relationships rather than pursuing authentic interests, avoiding conflict rather than expressing genuine opinions. Consider how much of your daily mental energy goes into social calculation. What will people think if I do this? How can I phrase this to avoid offending anyone? What version of myself should I present in this situation? How can I maintain harmony while getting what I need? These constant social calculations consume enormous psychological resources that could otherwise be directed toward creative projects, skill development, or authentic self-discovery. The exhaustion that many people feel in social situations isn't necessarily introversion. It's the natural result of constant performance. Maintaining social masks, managing impressions, and navigating interpersonal dynamics requires tremendous energy because it involves suppressing your spontaneous responses in favor of socially appropriate ones. Even in your closest relationships, this performance dynamic persists. The couple that has been together for decades still engages in subtle impression management, each partner presenting slightly edited versions of themselves to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. The family members who claim unconditional love still modify their behavior to maintain family peace and avoid topics that might create tension. This isn't necessarily conscious deception. Much of social performance happens automatically, below conscious awareness. You've learned to edit yourself so habitually that it feels natural, even necessary for civilized interaction. But this automatic editing means that even your most intimate relationships involve layers of performance that prevent others from knowing your complete, unfiltered reality. The tragedy of social performance is that it prevents not only others from knowing your authentic self, but also prevents you from knowing your authentic self. When you're always performing some version of who you think you should be, you lose touch with who you actually are, underneath all the social roles and expectations. You may discover that you don't know your genuine preferences when they don't have to accommodate others' needs. You may find that you're uncertain about your authentic opinions when they don't have to consider others' feelings. You may realize that you're unclear about your true desires when they don't have to fit within socially acceptable parameters. The person who has spent their life performing belonging may eventually discover that they've become so skilled at social performance that they've forgotten how to simply exist without an audience. They don't know how to be alone with themselves because they've always defined themselves in relationship to others. They don't know their authentic voice because they've always spoken in tones designed to please or persuade others. This discovery can be profoundly unsettling because it reveals the extent to which your sense of self has been constructed from external sources rather than internal development. You may realize that much of what you thought was your personality was actually just learned behavior designed to maintain belonging, and that your authentic self remains largely unknown, waiting to be discovered in solitude. Society fears nothing more than the person who has discovered they don't need others for validation, identity, or emotional stability. The individual who has learned to be completely comfortable in their own company, who derives their sense of worth from internal rather than external sources, who can make decisions based on their authentic preferences rather than social expectations. This person represents a threat to every system that depends on human dependency and conformity. This fear manifests in how culture characterizes solitude and independence. The person who chooses to spend time alone is labeled antisocial, lonely, or emotionally damaged. The individual who makes decisions without extensive consultation with others is called selfish or arrogant. The one who doesn't seek others' approval for their choices is deemed uncaring or narcissistic. These characterizations serve to make independence seem pathological rather than powerful, to make solitude seem like failure rather than strength, to make self-sufficiency seem like deficiency rather than capability. They create social pressure to remain dependent on others for emotional support, identity validation, and decision-making guidance. But examine the lives of people who have achieved genuine independence, who have learned to be truly comfortable with solitude, who have developed authentic self-knowledge and self-respect. Are they lonely and miserable, as social conditioning suggests they should be? Or are they often the most creative, productive, and genuinely confident people you encounter? The artist who spends hours alone in their studio, developing their craft without need for constant feedback or approval. The entrepreneur who pursues their vision despite social skepticism, trusting their own judgment more than consensus opinion. The thinker who develops original ideas in solitude rather than simply recombining popular concepts. The individual who travels alone makes major life decisions independently and derives genuine satisfaction from their own company. These people haven't become independent because they hate others or because they're incapable of connection. They've become independent because they've discovered something that dependent people never learn, that the relationship you have with yourself is the foundation for every other relationship in your life, and that this primary relationship can only be developed in solitude. The fear of authentic independence runs so deep in human culture because independence threatens the basic structures that hold society together. Families depend on members who will sacrifice individual desires for group stability. Employers depend on workers who will subordinate personal interests to organizational goals. Political systems depend on citizens who will defer to authority rather than thinking independently. Religious institutions depend on followers who will accept doctrine rather than developing personal spiritual understanding. The truly independent person disrupts all of these dependency relationships. They don't automatically sacrifice their interests for family harmony. They evaluate each situation based on their authentic values and make decisions accordingly. They don't automatically subordinate their goals to employer demands. They view employment as a mutual exchange that must benefit both parties. They don't automatically defer to authority. They evaluate authority claims based on evidence and reasoning rather than position or tradition. This independence makes them unpredictable and uncontrollable, which generates anxiety in systems designed around predictable human behavior. The independent person might choose to support their family, or they might choose to pursue their own path, depending on what serves their authentic development. They might be a loyal employee, or they might start their own business, depending on what aligns with their genuine interests. They might follow conventional wisdom, or they might forge their own path, depending on what their own experience and judgment suggest. The unpredictability of authentic independence is why society works so hard to make independence seem lonely, selfish, and ultimately unfulfilling. If too many people discovered that they could be genuinely happy without constant external validation, without conforming to social expectations, without sacrificing their authentic desires for group acceptance, the entire social order would become unstable. But the people who do discover this independence often find that it leads not to loneliness, but to more authentic relationships, not to selfishness, but to more genuine generosity, not to isolation, but to more meaningful connection with others who also value authenticity over performance. The independent person can choose relationships based on genuine attraction and compatibility rather than need and dependency. They can be generous from a position of strength rather than from a need to earn approval. They can connect with others as equals rather than as people seeking validation or trying to fill internal voids through external relationships. This authentic independence requires confronting one of the most frightening realities of human existence, that no one else can make you complete, happy, or fulfilled. These states must be developed internally through your relationship with yourself, through your own growth and self-understanding, through your ability to find meaning and satisfaction in your own experience. The person who accepts this responsibility discovers that independence isn't isolation from others. It's freedom to engage with others from a position of wholeness rather than need. It's the difference between relationships based on mutual enhancement and relationships based on mutual dependency, between connection chosen from strength and connection sought from weakness. But reaching this independence requires spending time alone with yourself, learning to be comfortable with your own thoughts and feelings, developing interests and capabilities that don't depend on others' participation or approval. It requires the courage to face your own consciousness without the distractions of social interaction, external entertainment, or constant activity. Most people are terrified of this solitude because they've never learned to enjoy their own company. They've become so dependent on external stimulation and validation that being alone with themselves feels empty, boring, or anxiety-provoking. They fill their time with social activities, media consumption, and busy work to avoid confronting the fundamental fact of their own consciousness and the responsibility of creating meaning from within rather than finding it in relationships with others. The most difficult truth about relationships is that they often prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be, not because relationships are inherently evil or because other people are necessarily malicious, but because maintaining relationships requires a level of consistency and accommodation that can freeze your development at whatever stage you were at when those relationships formed. Every relationship creates implicit contracts about who you are and how you will behave. Your family expects you to remain recognizable as the child they raised, maintaining familiar patterns and predictable responses. Your friends expect you to continue being the person they originally connected with, sharing similar interests and values. Your romantic partners expect you to remain compatible with their needs and desires, maintaining the qualities that initially attracted them. These relationship contracts provide stability and security, but they also create powerful pressures against growth and change. When you begin to develop new interests, adopt different values, or express aspects of yourself that weren't visible when your relationships formed, you often encounter resistance from people who preferred you as you were. The family that expects you to maintain the same role you played in childhood, the responsible one, the rebel, the peacekeeper, the entertainer, may become uncomfortable when you outgrow that role and want to express different aspects of your personality. The friends who bonded with you over shared struggles may feel threatened when you resolve those struggles and want to explore new possibilities. The partner who fell in love with your neediness may feel insecure when you develop independence and self-sufficiency. This resistance to your growth often manifests as subtle emotional manipulation designed to pull you back into familiar patterns. Family members may guilt you for changing, suggesting that your growth is selfish or that you're abandoning your roots. Friends may criticize your new interests as pretentious or worry that you're becoming someone they don't recognize. Partners may interpret your independence as rejection or your new ambitions as threats to the relationship. The person who is heavily invested in maintaining relationships often finds themselves unconsciously limiting their own development to avoid triggering this resistance. They suppress new interests that their friends don't share, downplay achievements that might make family members uncomfortable, or abandon goals that partners find threatening. Over time, this accommodation creates what psychologists call relationship imprisonment, a condition where your growth is constrained by the need to maintain compatibility with people who knew you at earlier stages of development. You become stuck, not because you lack the capability for growth, but because growth would require disappointing people who are invested in keeping you as you are. Consider how many people remain in careers that no longer interest them because changing careers would disappoint family members who are proud of their professional identity. Or how many individuals suppress their artistic, spiritual, or intellectual development because pursuing these interests would create distance from friends who don't share these aspirations. The tragedy is that this accommodation often doesn't even preserve the relationships it's meant to protect. Suppressing your authentic development to maintain compatibility with others often breeds resentment, boredom, and a sense of living an inauthentic life. You may maintain the external form of relationships while losing the vitality and genuine connection that made those relationships valuable in the first place. The person who has never learned to be alone often remains trapped in relationships that have outgrown their usefulness because they fear the isolation that might come with authentic self-development. They choose familiar limitation over unknown possibility, comfortable stagnation over potentially lonely growth. This imprisonment is particularly tragic because it's often maintained by love rather than malice. The people who resist your growth may genuinely care about you and believe they're protecting you from making mistakes or changing in ways that will make you unhappy. They may not realize that their protective instincts are actually limiting your potential and keeping you from discovering who you might become if you were free to develop without their well-meaning constraints. The relationship prison becomes even more confining when you internalize others' expectations and begin to police your own development. You start to evaluate your interests, goals, and changes not based on whether they serve your authentic development, but based on whether they will maintain harmony in your existing relationships. You may find yourself thinking, I can't pursue this opportunity because it would mean less time with my family. I shouldn't develop this interest because my friends wouldn't understand. I can't change in this way because my partner needs me to remain as I am. These internal restrictions often become more limiting than any external pressure because they operate continuously, preventing you from even considering possibilities that might threaten relationship stability. The alternative, learning to prioritize your authentic development over relationship maintenance, requires the courage to disappoint people you care about, to outgrow relationships that no longer serve your growth, and to accept that some people may not be able to support the person you're becoming. This doesn't mean becoming callous or abandoning all consideration for others' feelings. It means recognizing that your primary responsibility is to your own development, and that relationships which cannot accommodate your growth are relationships that ultimately serve no one's highest interests. The person who learns to prioritize authentic development often discovers that they become more valuable to others, not less. When you're growing, learning, and becoming more of who you're meant to be, you bring more energy, creativity, and genuine enthusiasm to your interactions with others. You become someone others can learn from, rather than someone who needs constant support and validation. But this transformation requires spending significant time alone, away from the subtle and not so subtle pressures of relationship maintenance. You need solitude to hear your own voice among the chorus of others' expectations, to discover your authentic interests without others' influence, and to develop the internal strength necessary to disappoint people when disappointing them serves your higher development. The person who has never learned to be productively alone often finds it impossible to distinguish between their authentic desires and the desires others have projected onto them. They don't know what they genuinely want because they've always filtered their wants through the question of what others would think, support, or approve. There comes a moment in every authentic life when you must choose between the comfort of familiar relationships and the unknown territory of your own potential. This choice cannot be postponed indefinitely, and it cannot be made collectively. It must be made alone, in the depths of solitude, where no other voice can influence your decision, and no external validation can substitute for your own inner knowing. Radical solitude is not simply being alone, it's the deliberate cultivation of your relationship with yourself as the primary source of meaning, validation, and identity in your life. It's the recognition that everything else, every relationship, every achievement, every external source of satisfaction is secondary to your ability to be genuinely comfortable and productive in your own company. This cultivation begins with learning to tolerate, then enjoy, then actively seek extended periods of time alone with your thoughts, feelings, and creative impulses. Most people are so accustomed to external stimulation and social interaction that being alone quickly becomes uncomfortable. They experience what they call boredom, but what they're actually experiencing is anxiety about confronting their own consciousness without distraction. The person beginning to develop radical solitude must work through this discomfort systematically. They must learn to sit with their thoughts without immediately reaching for entertainment, social media, or other forms of external stimulation. They must become comfortable with silence, both external and internal, allowing their mind to settle into states that are impossible when constantly responding to others' needs and expectations. In this silence, something remarkable begins to emerge: your authentic voice. Not the voice that has been shaped by years of social conditioning and relationship dynamics, but the voice that represents your genuine interests, values, and aspirations. This voice may surprise you with its differences from what you thought you wanted or believed about yourself. You may discover interests you never knew you had because they weren't shared by people in your social circle. You may find yourself drawn to activities, ideas, or experiences that don't fit the identity others have constructed for you. You may realize that many of your apparent preferences were actually adaptations to others' preferences, chosen to maintain harmony rather than expressing authentic attraction. This discovery process requires courage because it often reveals the extent to which your life has been shaped by others rather than by your own genuine choices. You may realize that your career was chosen to please parents, your hobbies were adopted to fit in with friends, your lifestyle was designed to attract a particular type of partner, or your values were accepted without examination to belong to a specific community. Radical solitude also means developing the capability to make important decisions without extensive consultation with others. This doesn't mean ignoring all advice or feedback, but it means developing sufficient self-knowledge and confidence in your own judgment that you can evaluate others' input without being swayed by their emotional investment in your choices. The person who has developed this capability can listen to others' opinions, consider their perspectives, and then make decisions based on their own analysis of what serves their authentic development. They're not trying to please everyone or avoid disappointing anyone. They're trying to make choices that align with their genuine understanding of what will create the life they actually want to live. This decision-making independence often creates tension in relationships because it means you may choose paths that others don't understand or support. Family members may feel hurt that you're not following their guidance. Friends may feel abandoned if your choices create distance from shared activities. Partners may feel insecure if your independent decisions don't automatically include their preferences. But radical solitude teaches you that these emotional responses from others are not your responsibility to manage. Your responsibility is to make choices that serve your authentic development, and their responsibility is to manage their own emotional responses to your choices. This boundary is essential for maintaining your independence while remaining compassionate toward others' feelings. Perhaps most importantly, radical solitude develops what we might call existential self-sufficiency, the ability to find meaning, purpose, and satisfaction in your own existence without requiring external validation or achievement to feel that your life is worthwhile. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others or abandoning all ambitions, but it means that your fundamental sense of worth comes from your relationship with yourself, rather than from others' responses to you. The person who has achieved existential self-sufficiency doesn't need constant reassurance that they're valuable, intelligent, attractive, or worthy of love. They've developed internal sources of these validations through their own self-knowledge, capability development, and authentic self-expression. They know their worth because they've done the work of discovering and developing their authentic capacities. This internal validation system makes them more attractive to others, not less, because they're interacting from a position of fullness rather than neediness. They're not seeking relationships to complete themselves, but to enhance themselves. They're not trying to prove their worth through others' approval, but to express their worth through authentic interaction. The paradox of radical solitude is that it often leads to deeper and more satisfying connections with others, because those connections are chosen rather than needed, authentic rather than performed, enhancing rather than completing. When you're genuinely comfortable alone, you can choose to be with others from a position of strength rather than from fear of isolation. But developing radical solitude requires accepting that some relationships may not survive your independence. People who benefited from your dependency, who enjoyed your need for their approval, who were comfortable with your willingness to suppress yourself for their comfort, may not be able to adapt to your new self-sufficiency. This acceptance is one of the most difficult aspects of embracing authentic solitude, because it means potentially losing relationships that have provided important sources of identity, belonging, and emotional support. It requires faith that the independence you gain will be more valuable than the relationships you lose, and that new, more authentic relationships will emerge as you become more genuinely yourself. The person who successfully navigates this transition discovers something that dependent people never learn, that being alone is not the same as being lonely, that independence is not the same as isolation, and that self-sufficiency is not the same as selfishness. They learn that radical solitude is not about rejecting others, but about engaging with others from a position of wholeness rather than need. We have reached the final truth, the one that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are alone. You have always been alone. And you will always be alone. This is not a tragedy to be overcome, a problem to be solved, or a condition to be cured. This is the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, and embracing it fully is the key to authentic freedom, genuine creativity, and paradoxically, the deepest connections possible with others. Your aloneness is not a bug in the system of human existence. It's the feature that makes everything else possible. Your unique perspective, your individual creativity, your personal growth, your authentic contributions to the world, all of these emerge from the irreducible fact that you experience reality from a singular point of consciousness that no one else can access or fully understand. This singular perspective is not a limitation. It's your superpower. Everything valuable you will ever create, every genuine insight you will ever have, every authentic relationship you will ever build, every meaningful achievement you will ever accomplish will emerge from your willingness to embrace and explore the unique territory of your own consciousness. The artist who creates work that moves others does so by diving deeply into their own solitary experience and finding universal truths in their personal exploration. The inventor who solves problems others couldn't solve does so by thinking thoughts that emerge from their individual perspective. The leader who inspires others does so by expressing authenticity that can only come from deep self-knowledge developed in solitude. Your aloneness is also your protection from the conformity pressures that diminish most people's potential. When you're comfortable being alone, you don't need others' approval to pursue your interests. When you're secure in your own company, you don't need to modify your behavior to maintain relationships. When you've developed internal sources of meaning and satisfaction, you don't need external validation to feel worthwhile. This protection allows you to take risks that approval seekers cannot take, to express ideas that conformists dare not voice, to pursue goals that would seem impossible to people who need consensus before acting. Your comfort with aloneness becomes the foundation for authentic courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your genuine values, despite fear and despite others' potential disapproval. The person who has fully embraced their aloneness discovers something remarkable. They become more attractive to others, not less. People are drawn to those who are genuinely comfortable with themselves, who don't need constant reassurance or validation, who can offer authentic presence rather than needy performance. When you're not desperately seeking connection to escape your aloneness, you can choose connections based on genuine compatibility and mutual enhancement. When you're not afraid of losing relationships, you can be honest in your communications. When you don't need others to complete you, you can appreciate them for who they are rather than for what they can provide. This leads to what we might call chosen solitude, the ability to be alone when aloneness serves your development, and to be with others when connection enhances your experience. You become neither antisocial nor dependent, but selectively social based on authentic attraction and mutual benefit. Embracing your essential aloneness also means accepting full responsibility for your life experience. You cannot blame your dissatisfaction on others' failure to understand you, support you, or love you properly. You cannot excuse your lack of achievement by pointing to others' failure to provide opportunities, encouragement, or assistance. Your aloneness means that your happiness, fulfillment, and success are ultimately your responsibility. Others may contribute to or detract from your experience, but the quality of your life depends primarily on what you do with your consciousness, your time, and your capabilities when you're alone with them. This responsibility is initially frightening because it means you have no one to blame for your circumstances and no one to rescue you from situations you don't like. But it's ultimately liberating because it means you have the power to create the life you want through your own efforts, choices, and development. The person who has accepted this responsibility stops waiting for others to change, for circumstances to improve, for opportunities to appear, or for recognition to arrive. They begin creating change through their own actions, improving circumstances through their own efforts, generating opportunities through their own initiatives, and building recognition through their own achievements. Your aloneness is also your access to the deepest sources of creativity and insight. The most profound thoughts, the most original ideas, the most innovative solutions emerge not from group brainstorming or collective wisdom, but from individual minds working in solitude, free from the constraining influence of others' expectations and assumptions. When you're alone with your thoughts, you can follow intellectual paths that might seem strange or unproductive to others. You can explore ideas without having to justify them before they're fully formed. You can make connections between seemingly unrelated concepts without having to explain your reasoning to anyone else. This solitary exploration is where genuine innovation happens, the breakthrough insights that advance human knowledge and capability almost always occur in individual minds that have spent significant time alone, wrestling with problems, exploring possibilities, and developing understanding without external pressure or interference. Direct eye contact with camera, final moments. You were born alone, and this aloneness is not your curse. It's your gift. It's the source of everything unique and valuable you will ever contribute to existence. It's the foundation of your authentic power, your genuine creativity, and your deepest satisfaction. Stop running from your aloneness. Stop trying to escape it through relationships, activities, or distractions. Stop apologizing for it or treating it as a problem to be solved. Instead, embrace it fully, cultivate it deliberately. Explore it fearlessly, use it creatively. Let it become the launching pad for a life that is genuinely your own, rather than a performance for others' approval. You are alone, you have always been alone, and you will always be alone. And in this aloneness lies your freedom, your power, and your greatest possibilities. Welcome to your authentic life. Let's begin by examining what most people call connection. Watch any group of friends having dinner, any family gathering, any couple claiming deep intimacy, and observe what's actually happening beneath the surface of apparent togetherness. Each person is trapped within their own subjective experience, interpreting everything through their personal psychological filters, responding based on their individual needs and desires, ultimately alone with their thoughts and feelings, even while surrounded by others. The conversation you think you're having with someone else is actually two separate monologues happening simultaneously. You speak your thoughts, shaped by your unique history and perspective, while they hear your words filtered through their own experiences and biases. They respond with their thoughts, formed by their distinct psychological makeup, while you interpret their words through your personal lens of expectation and assumption. What we call understanding is really just the coincidental overlap of two fundamentally separate subjective realities. When someone says they get you, what they really mean is that their interpretation of your words happens to align with your intention. But this alignment is temporary, partial, and constantly shifting based on mood, circumstance, and the ever-changing nature of individual perspective. Consider what happens when you try to share your deepest experience with another person. You attempt to translate the ineffable reality of your inner world into words, knowing even as you speak that language is inadequate to capture the full dimensionality of your experience. The other person listens through the filter of their own experience, constructing meaning based on their own reference points, their own emotional associations, their own understanding of similar situations. No matter how articulate you are, no matter how empathetic they are, the experience you're trying to share remains forever trapped within your consciousness. They can approximate understanding, they can offer sympathy or advice, they can relate through similar experiences of their own, but they can never actually enter your subjective reality and experience what you experience from the inside. This isn't a failure of communication. It's the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. Each mind exists in its own sealed universe of perception, thought, and feeling. What we call relationships are really elaborate performances where two or more sealed universes engage in synchronized behaviors while remaining eternally separate. The person lying next to you in bed, no matter how intimate your physical connection, remains as foreign to your inner experience as a stranger on the street. The family member who has known you since birth has access only to their interpretation of your behavior, never to the actual experience of being you. The best friend who claims to know you better than anyone knows only the version of yourself that you've chosen to reveal, filtered through their own psychological needs and projections. Yet society has built an entire mythology around the possibility of true connection. We're told that the right relationship will complete us, that finding our soulmate will end our loneliness, that building a family will give us the belonging we crave. We're promised that if we just learn to communicate better, if we become more vulnerable, if we work harder at our relationships, we can bridge the gap between separate consciousnesses. This mythology serves important social functions. It keeps people bonded together long enough to raise children, build communities, and maintain the stability that civilization requires. It provides comfort and hope in the face of existential isolation. It creates meaning systems that make life feel purposeful, even when individual existence feels arbitrary. But the mythology comes with a devastating cost. It makes you dependent on others for validation, completion, and identity. You learn to evaluate your worth based on how others respond to you, rather than developing authentic self-knowledge. You become addicted to external approval, rather than building genuine self-respect. You spend your life performing for others instead of discovering who you are when no one is watching. The person who believes deeply in human connection often becomes emotionally dependent on maintaining that connection. They modify their behavior to keep others happy, suppress their authentic desires to maintain harmony, and gradually lose touch with their own nature in service of preserving relationships that are, ultimately, elaborate mutual illusions. They fear being alone not because aloneness is inherently painful, but because they've never learned to be comfortable with their own consciousness. They've become so focused on external relationships that they've never developed an internal relationship with themselves. They know how to be a friend, partner, family member, or colleague, but they don't know how to simply be themselves without a social role to define them. This dependency on others for identity and validation creates what we might call relationship addiction, the compulsive need to maintain connections, even when those connections drain energy, limit growth, or require constant performance of inauthentic versions of yourself. The relationship addict stays in unfulfilling partnerships, maintains exhausting friendships, and participates in family dynamics that diminish their potential, all because the fear of being alone feels more threatening than the cost of inauthentic connection. You entered this world alone, completely alone, Despite being surrounded by doctors, nurses, and anxious family members, your first breath was taken in absolute solitude. Your consciousness emerged from nothingness into a reality where you were the only observer of your own existence, the sole inhabitant of your inner world, the singular witness to your own experience. And you will leave this world exactly as you entered it, alone.